We're back live on the Friday edition of the Alex Jones Show. I'm Paul Joseph Watson, filling in for Alex, who will be back on Sunday for the Sunday show. We're now going to be joined by Syrian girl, Syrian activist and blogger, who, of course, needs no introduction. She's been on the show many times. Syrian girl, welcome to the Alex Jones Show.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Now, let's talk about ISIS first, because, of course, we had these airstrikes launched in Iraq, what was it, a couple of months ago now. They expanded them into Syria back a couple of weeks ago. No real news, though, on what kind of effect they're having. There was one Marine who died. He went missing, I believe it was yesterday. But in terms of ISIS, we've not really heard anything about whether or not these airstrikes are actually pushing them back, allowing whoever rebels the US wants to support this week to take back the territory supposedly vacated in the aftermath of those airstrikes. So tell us exactly the situation, if these airstrikes are actually having an impact on these ISIS militants.
I think it's clear if you watch the news that ISIS is still advancing. They've been advancing on Kobane, which is in the north of Syria, the northeast of Syria. It's a Kurdish town, and if anyone's been observing the news, they've almost taken the town now, and they've absolutely taken an area called Ain al-Arab. And also they've been advancing in Iraq, and they've been getting closer and closer to Baghdad. So as many people predicted, these airstrikes really do nothing but create more recruits for ISIS. Because once the airstrikes began, there was talk that the actual recruitment for ISIS doubled, with more and more of these youths being convinced that, after all, we are fighting the US. The US isn't backing ISIS, that's caused more recruits. So the only way to really fight these groups is to stop the source and to cut the umbilical cord of their supporters, which are, again, Turkey and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
Now, there was a report 6,000 new ISIS members just days after these airstrikes in Syria have been launched. And it's a point that I've made many times before. You flood the region with weapons, you bomb the region, you only create more radicalization. All the university studies show that bombing the region, flooding it with weapons, only causes more terrorism, and yet the United States continues to do so. Are they merely creating the terrorists they need to justify further military occupation and expansion in the Middle East?
Well, you have to judge people by what they do, not what they say. And in spite of all the rhetoric of fighting terrorism, what they've done for the last 10 years, in fact, or more, is to create these terrorist groups and to keep them growing. I mean, it was clear that the training and the weapons they gave to the FSA went into the hands of ISIS eventually, when the FSA, or they call them moderate rebels, defected to ISIS and took all the weapons and training that the US provided with them. It's a clear double standard, and we predicted, in fact, on my channel, I said that these strikes are only going to gain ISIS more recruits, and that is exactly what happened. And of course, the Syrian Air Force was already airstriking the areas in Raqqa where ISIS were. So more airstrikes isn't actually going to do anything. What needs to stop is allowing these groups across the border, and Turkey, a NATO member, a US ally, has so far not done so. In fact, there's plenty of videos and footage online of ISIS merchandise being sold in Istanbul, Turkey, and ISIS members actually being given medical aid by Turkey. So I don't think that this would occur without the US's okay, because Turkey is, after all, a NATO member, and it's subject to some sort of influence by the US as well. Also, we should talk about the other group, not just ISIS, but Jabhat al-Nusra as well.
Exactly. There's a Financial Times article, Syria Islamists seek truce with ISIS after being targeted by US. And this is Jabhat al-Nusra, who, of course, many of the so-called moderate FSA groups pledged allegiance to as far back as 2012, I believe. And Jabhat al-Nusra is, of course, a radical extremist jihadist group that's committed atrocities almost on a par with ISIS. They're now embroiled in bed with the FSA. Tell us about Jabhat al-Nusra and how they relate to the ISIS militant group.
Well, absolutely, they're just as barbaric, if not more so, and they are on par with ISIS. They were around before ISIS, and they are very similar to the other insurgent groups in Syria that are extremist and sectarian. And if you recall, there was a split between Al Qaeda um, and ISIS, and that also coincided between a split between Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS as well. And now that the US is bombing both ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra at the same time, instead of splitting them up, they've actually unified them into one big group. And not only them, in fact, it's called the Hazm movement, which is the moderate rebel group that the US has provided arms to and training. The only group that it has provided arms to, on paper, not with the back doors and as a middleman. But this group that started as the moderate group actually condemned the strikes against Jabhat al-Nusra. Because they have said in the past, they've told the Independent that Jabhat al-Nusra is their ally in the war against the Syrian government and Assad, and they basically have no problem with Jabhat al-Nusra. It's not their problem, it's the US's problem, and they're not going to fight it. So the idea that these moderate rebels are against Al-Qaeda or fighting Al-Qaeda has now been exposed as complete lies, basically.
Now, I believe it was 2 days ago or 3 days ago, there was a huge bombing in Homs, in a, quote, government-controlled area, of a school, which killed 41 school children. Now you see the Al Jazeera headline, children killed in Homs, double blast, killed 45 people, including 41 children. This basically got no mainstream coverage whatsoever. It was in Al Jazeera. Imagine if a school was bombed in America and 41 kids died. I mean, that... No attention whatsoever on this. And why? Well, because it's being carried out by the very same rebels that are in bed with the FSA, which are about to receive a huge new cache of weapons courtesy of the Obama administration. So tell us about this school bombing that just occurred.
Well, it's very easy for the media who do report it to try to blame it on ISIS, but actually ISIS doesn't have much of a presence in the Homs region in the southwest of Syria. They do have a presence, but it's very minimal. And what happened was Homs was touted as the heart of the revolution only about a year ago, until it was actually taken back by the government forces and the military. So the Syrian troops secured these areas, and now the only way that these extremist militias can extract basically vengeance upon those residents of Homs that are now living their daily lives is to have these suicide bombings. And it wouldn't be the first time. That area has been under car bombs like twice or three times in the past. And the fact that BBC and, I've looked up the coverage of the story and it's very minimal. They try to ignore it because they don't want to point out the atrocities of the rebels that they have been supporting for the last 3 years and calling democratic, freedom fighters. And this attack against this school was a deliberate attack. There was no military targets anywhere around the proximity of the region. There were not any soldiers or anything like that. And the bombs went off just as the kids were coming out of the school. And there's video footage of it online, and it's quite horrific. I would warn anyone that would search for it. But it's interesting also that some of these human rights groups and NGOs also didn't have much of coverage of it. And in fact, the Syrian Electronic Army had to hack into the Twitter and the page of UNICEF just to get them to cover the Homs car bombing. And as soon as they got their accounts back, of course, they deleted any evidence of the car bombing of the school.
So did anyone actually claim responsibility for the bombing?
As far as I know, not yet, no. But it's quite a cowardly attack, and I think it's clearly to revenge against these people that are going back to live in Homs. They want to make sure that they don't live peacefully, or perhaps even to try to kick them out of Homs and to restart things there, because Homs is a very important city. All roads lead to Homs and into Lebanon. So this is one of the reasons why it became the heart of the revolution, because it's a very strategic city.
And there was this new group that suddenly emerged out of nowhere, Khorasan, a couple of weeks ago, which the Obama administration claimed it had bombed. Tell us about Khorasan. Is that a real group, or is it just an offshoot of Jabhat al-Nusra?
Khorasan is basically just Jabhat al-Nusra. And I don't know why they've decided to give them a new name. I suspect it's because they don't want to make it clear that they're targeting Jabhat al-Nusra, because it would anger all of the moderate rebels that they're supporting in Syria, and anger all of the people in Syria who support the insurgency and the revolution, who also happen to support Jabhat al-Nusra. And you can see that, again, even the group that the US has said that these are the moderates and these are the people we're giving weapons to, said that, we condemn the strikes against Jabhat al-Nusra.
Okay, we'll be back after the break. Calls for Syrian Girl, 1-800-259-9231. This is the Alex Jones Show Live. Get your calls in. We're back live on the Alex Jones Show Friday edition with me, Paul Joseph Watson. Breaking news, the hazmat teams that are there to clean up the Ebola-infected apartment of Ebola victim Thomas Duncan, who, of course, came into Dallas a few days ago, have finally arrived 3 days after the fact, after he was announced to be the first Ebola victim in the United States. So it took the CDC at least 3 days to dispatch a proper hazmat team to clean up that apartment, again underlining the alarming incompetence of the federal government in dealing with this Ebola outbreak. Mimi Al-Laham, Syrian Girl, I know you've been tracking Ebola. You made a video about that recently. Give us your take on the Ebola outbreak.
Well, I've actually been looking into Ebola because it's a very interesting virus for many years now. And I remember just learning about how it's one of the deadliest viruses known to man. It has a 90% kill rate, especially the Zaire strain, which is apparently the strain we're facing right now. And interestingly, there was no Ebola before the 1970s. And the first case of Ebola was actually not in Africa. Well, an Ebola-like virus, the relative of it being Marburg. The first case of Marburg, which was related to Ebola, was actually in Germany. And only after that were the second cases that came out in Africa. So the origins of Ebola are actually not known about. And this outbreak seems to be different to any other outbreak in the past, because in the past Ebola has killed so quickly and so with such a high rate that it hasn't been able to spread. But in this case, it seems to be spreading out of control. Nobody knows why this outbreak occurred and why it seems to be different from all the rest.
So do you think there may be a possibility that it's gone airborne, at least to a limited extent, as many of the other experts are now saying, including the UN Ebola chief yesterday said that it could mutate and go airborne, that was the main threat now?
Well, I've read that once viruses enter enough hosts that they could mutate and go airborne. The thing is, Ebola, just as it is now, is classified as a Category A biological weapon. And they've had actually teams in Sierra Leone and in other regions of Africa actually researching Ebola for its use as a biological weapon. The US military has had scientists researching about it there. And that's all, open knowledge. So I don't know any information about what is actually the cause of Ebola, but these points are interesting to note because, of course, in this kind of world that we're living in, on the verge of World War III, and with the superpowers all trying to outdo each other, research into biological weapons is the sort of in the next step besides nuclear weapons. It's interesting if Ebola does go airborne, though, that it would be really disastrous. But I do know that sometimes when viruses mutate into something airborne, that actually may or may not make them less deadly. So we'll see how that goes. It may have already gone airborne, but usually you can actually tell by the shape of the virus whether or not it's capable of being airborne. Certainly, it seems to be very contagious, and maybe it's spread by even small particles of the virus of the saliva in air could potentially spread the virus as well.
And what do you think about the health authorities in the United States? You know, they let this guy walk around for 2 days. Actually, 4 days. He went back to the hospital 2 days later. They let him walk around for the best part of a week, infected with Ebola. The response since has been nothing more than pathetic. They've the apartment there, they've sent in people with unprotected gear to literally hose down the Ebola sick off the sidewalk. They've let sheriff's deputies into the apartment with no protection whatsoever. What do you think about the federal government response and what it says about how prepared the United States is for an Ebola outbreak?
I think it's really shocking, the fact that the man went to hospital and told them that he's just come back from Africa in one of the infected countries. I'm not sure if it was Liberia or Sierra Leone.
Okay, we'll be back after the break. Your calls for Syrian Girl. This is the Alex Jones Show live. Infowars.com. Keep it locked in.
Introducing the first proprietary oxygen-based intestinal cleanser, OxyPowder. Backed by real FDA-approved phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. People are suffering from all kinds of digestive issues these days. All the toxins from the air, the food, the water, ultimately ends up in the gut or affects the gut. My main focus was to come up with a remedy for this, something that's safe and effective that anyone can take on a regular basis to keep their intestinal lining clean. My recommendation is to clean your intestines at least 2 to 3 times a week to prevent the toxic buildup from going into your bloodstream. Take your health into your own hands and start cleansing your body today with OxyPowder. Secure your OxyPowder today at InfoWarsLife.com. That's InfoWarsLife.com.
We're back live, Friday edition of the Alex Jones Show, talking to Syrian Girl, otherwise known as Mimi Allaham. Your calls coming shortly. Huffington Post. Global warming created ISIS. Yes, that was an actual article in the Huffington Post. You see, there was a drought in Syria from 2006 to 2010. And they claim that happened because of climate change, even though droughts worldwide over the last 30 years are down. They blamed this drought for being responsible for the rise of jihadists in Syria and ISIS, even though ISIS was not even formed in Syria. Of course, it was formed in Iraq. So these climate change alarmists are now actually blaming global warming for the rise of jihadists in Syria. Mimi Alham, of course, nothing to do with the fact that the US armed the jihadists in the first place, that they trained ISIS members in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, bankrolled them to the hilt. It can all be explained by global warming. What do you think of that?
Well, even the drought itself wasn't caused by global warming. It was caused by the Turkish president damming the river that runs into Syria in order to destabilize the Syrian government. And he's on record for saying, telling the previous president, Hafez al-Assad, not this current one, that, your people can drink sand. And that is the reason for the drought in Syria. It wasn't global warming in the first place. The Turkish government did this purposely to get people, to get the Syrian economy weakened and to get people angry. And it continues to be Turkish policy and the US government policy that leads to these jihadist groups and has led to groups like ISIS. And, interestingly, the Turkish government now are talking about having invasion plans into Syria, using ISIS as an excuse and saving the Kurds as an excuse. because of the problems now happening on the Turkish border. 200,000 Kurds have crossed into Turkey now, Syrian Kurds crossing into Turkey. And of course, Turkey actually doesn't like having Kurds coming into Turkey because they see Kurds as a potential threat and separatists. And as a result, that is probably one of the reasons they are worrying about what's happening in Syria right now. And they, in fact, the Turkish war leaks in 6 months ago revealed where Erdogan's ministers were talking about war plans in Syria, that they were going to use ISIS in a false flag operation on a Turkish tomb and to try to get some excuse to go into Syria. And that's all on YouTube. You can have a look at it. And as a result, Erdogan actually shut YouTube down that day just to prevent his people from listening to it just before the election.
Okay, we're going to get back into ISIS soon with the callers, but we're running low on time now. So let's get into Gamergate. This is an amazing topic that's kind of slipped under the radar over the past month or so. It began in August. And this is an attempt by individuals to hijack the video game industry to implant social engineering and basically brainwashing messages. Explain how that emerged.
Well, actually, Gamergate is a very, very interesting and promising sort of Twitter phenomenon that's going on right now. It's a hashtag on Twitter of gamers who have actually been able to expose collusion between the media and a think tank called DIGRA, which is supported by DARPA, the military and government ministry. So this DARPA is providing money to this think tank called DIGRA that's specializing in sort of injecting social engineering into video games. And they're trying to sort of say, apply their sort of multiple genders, as we saw in Facebook, and they call them social justice warriors, sort of a fake pseudo-feminism, taking up the cause of racism, feminism, and all of those things, not in real support of equality, but to try to pit races and genders against each other. And what's happened is that these gamers have rejected these people and have been sort of starting to make connections between the video game journalism, these think tanks, and certain video game developers that are creating games specifically to social engineer people. One of those is, her name is, I forget her first name, but her last name is Quinn.
Zoe Quinn, yeah.
Zoe Quinn, exactly. And they sort of exposed her connections. And after that, all across all the game journalists, they wrote down the same story. Gamers are dead. The game development industry should ignore their market and start producing games that are politically correct and no longer consider what the gamers themselves want, but sort of what the think tanks and the academics and the social engineers want them to produce. And all the journalists seem to be colluded on that. And what's going on now is these gamers have a mission now to expose these think tanks and these connections with what they themselves, what even the CEO of a big game industry called Electronic Arts called in his memo the establishment elite. The establishment elite have injected themselves into movies, film, television, into social media to try to socially engineer society. And it seems that they haven't completely controlled the game industry. They have to some degree in the military aspect of it, but not in the social aspect of it. And that's what they're trying to do right now.
And that's all about shifting the propaganda over from news to entertainment, because they know a lot of young people are turned off by the news. So now they're shifting it, as you said, into video games, movies, television shows. And this is red flag bombshell proof of a deliberate attempt to undermine and hijack the video games industry to implant that politically correct social engineering. It's a story we're going to be covering more in the future. But now we're going to go to calls for Syrian Girl. We got Habu in Wisconsin. Go ahead, Habu. You're on the air.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I always learn something listening to Syrian Girl. So you're very enlightening to to the people here. Let me just have a comment, and I'll be very quick, and then I'll ask you a question. I do believe the U.S. has an obligation to put armed forces on the ground, coordinated with the Syrian forces and the Iraqi forces, to drive out or to corner these people. In my estimation, with the superior American air power, this should be a pretty straightforward thing, and in under 6 months, this would be done. So my question to Syrian Girl, there's just two quick questions. One, do you think President Assad is really setting himself up for regime change as this bombing just morphs and kind of encroaches upon his power centers, meaning the air? And the second thing is, I think that the present Iraqi constitution should be torn up and written anew so that it embraces all different types of people in Iraqi society, which it doesn't do now. So thank you very much for the courtesy, and keep on enlightening the world, Syrian Girl.
Thank you so much for your kind words. In principle, the idea of the U.S. and Syria coordinating against these extremist groups like ISIS, that might be a good idea. But in fact, I think that U.S. troops on the ground anywhere in the Middle East is just going to exacerbate matters. U.S. troops on the ground would only embolden these groups into fighting and gaining more recruits and believing that their cause is the right cause. And I think that with everything that the U.S. has been doing in the region, especially since they've been supporting these Islamist groups that are extreme in Libya as well as Syria, they really don't have any agenda to actually fight ISIS. ISIS is basically the monster they created in order to have an excuse, some kind of excuse to intervene. I think that the Syrian people, we don't want any foreigners on the ground. We don't need any help. All we need is for the people who are supporting these groups and who are arming the insurgents to stop undermining the state, to stop undermining the military, and then we can take care of it ourselves. We can clear things up in a few months, and our military is more than capable of doing that. They just have to stop the money flow, and that would be all. But I do think that the U.S. strikes on Syria right now, just as I said, it's not so much about fighting ISIS. As we've seen, ISIS is still gaining ground. They're still gaining recruits, even more so now. So it's not really about fighting ISIS. I think it does still have a lot to do with regime change. And finally, about the Iraqi constitution, the Iraqi constitution was written during the U.S. occupation of Iraq. And I know that James Steele and Robert Ford had an agenda to create a civil war in Iraq, to put Sunnis and Shiites against each other, and to eventually balkanize the country. And they wrote up the constitution themselves, and the majority, the only part of the Iraqi society voted for it. So it was divisive to begin with. And I totally agree with you on the Iraqi constitution on that point.
Slim in Canada, you're on the air with Syrian Girl. Go ahead, Slim.
Hi, Syrian Girl. First of all, Eid Mubarak. And
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. My question is regarding ISIS. A while back, I used to be a gamer myself. It's funny you guys mentioned that. The gaming industry, I used to play this game called Call of Duty, and there used to be this, you could create clans, and the strongest and most vast clan in that game when I played it a few years ago was ISIS. I don't know if that's a coincidence or what's going on, but with respect to them being just basically a cult, they are basically just a death cult. To me, that's what my opinion of them. And the fact that they have the name the Islamic State is just, a slap in the face for everybody as far as I'm concerned. What do you guys think about that?
Your comment, Syrian Girl.
I think it's basically the worst kind of face you could give to Islam, and maybe that's part of the agenda. We're talking about a clash of civilizations, and these kind of groups, they didn't exist before. This is a recent phenomena, and most of the people they're killing are actually Muslims. So it's funny that they should call themselves the Islamic State. I find it very interesting that the biggest clan in Call of Duty was ISIS. I was wondering if it stood for anything. That would be interesting to know if it was an acronym for anything.
Derek in Wyoming, you're on the air with Syrian Girl. Go ahead, Derek.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Syrian Girl. I just want to tell InfoWars I appreciate all you're doing, and I believe we can wake people up in our areas on vaccines and everything else. I've done so with Common Core and visited our local county nurse on vaccines. They're looking at it. I think we got to get off our couches. And Syrian Girl, thank you so much. And it seems to me that she should be on every network talking about this, but they just have propaganda. So I want to ask you, Syrian Girl, why do you think that Israel is not being targeted by ISIS?
That's a very, very good question. Why indeed is Israel not being targeted by ISIS? I think that none of these groups seem to be really targeting Israel. And in fact, Israel is helping Jabhat al-Nusra on the Syrian Golan Heights borders. And this is a fact that they're giving them medical aid, treating their wounds, giving them a buffer zone, and shooting down any Syrian airplane, jet, or helicopter that is chasing Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda group, down. So Israel is sort of acting as the air defenses of Al-Qaeda. And it's very interesting why these groups who are supposed to be so, anti any other religion wouldn't attack Israel. And I think that maybe it has something to do with the people who control ISIS, leading them and directing them to attack, Syria instead of Israel. So.
Sanger in Texas, you're on the air with Syrian Girl. Your question, go ahead. Do we have Sanger in Texas? Frank in Carolina, go ahead.
Yes, you can hear me?
Yeah, you're on the air. Go ahead, Frank.
Okay. Dr. Watson, with respect to your coverage of the Ebola thing, I sometimes think we give agencies like the CDC way too much credit for incompetence and whatnot. I mean, the way I look at it, I'm not even following it that closely, but if they wanted to create some type of a crisis, they couldn't do a better job as far as setting all the chess pieces into place. And that's my take on it, and I know a lot of other people would agree with that. And Syrian Girl, I had a question for you. Would you say, based on your research into all the goings-on in the Middle East and with ISIS, that this is probably being engineered and managed by the Nazis or perhaps their descendants?
I don't have any details about that, but I do believe that, you can kill a man, but you can't kill an idea. So maybe, in some degree, there's a connection between, the fascism of old, or the groups that basically the establishment elite who created these ideologies, whether they be Nazism or Marxism or, anything that was useful at the time, whether they be good ideologies or bad ideologies. I don't really, I wouldn't say, Nazis are behind these things, but certainly there's been a rise of neo-Nazism in Ukraine. That's as far as I can really comment on that.
Bruce in Michigan wants to talk about Iran. You're on the air with Syrian Girl. Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, okay, thank you. There are more Christians in Lebanon and Syria than anywhere else in the Middle East. And no one, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, Paris, London, or Washington would replace Mr. Assad with would be better for the Christians than Mr. Assad. I just read some articles by Bassem Marou out of Lebanon, and of course Craig Roberts, about how Christians are arming themselves again in Lebanon, and they can see what's coming down the pike. Our government and mass media have hoodwinked us into supporting an air campaign. Now they're talking about troops on the ground there in Syria. Now, there was a CIA guy, some kind of deputy named Michael Mellon, who said that they will probably have to assassinate Mr. Assad. I don't think Russia is going to help you this time. I remember back, when was it? A couple of years ago, there were 400,000 people in the streets there in Damascus cheering Lavrov after they vetoed that first no-fly zone resolution. I don't think Russia has guts enough to do it. I think they're tucking their tail between their legs and pussyfooting. Doesn't this mean that Iran will be Syria's last hope for defense against regime change?
Okay, we'll get Syrian Girl's answer to that question after the break. We're going to get into some more personal details about what Syrian Girl has faced in standing up against the propaganda that's been in favour of overthrowing the regime in Syria. David Knight also coming up in studio. We're going to cover more news, the entire waterfront of issues, the economy as well. This is the Alex Jones Show live, Infowars.com. Don't go away. We're back live on the Alex Jones Show. Quick news update here out of CBS Atlanta. Report inmate at Cobb County Jail being tested for Ebola. Of course, earlier we had potential cases in DC and Toronto. Thankfully, most of these cases normally turn out to be negative. But an inmate at the Cobb County Jail is reportedly being tested for Ebola. We'll keep track of that. Also, the cleanup crew, the hazmat crew en route to that apartment, the potentially Ebola-infected apartment in Dallas, have been delayed once again because they haven't got a permit. So the incompetence of the CDC continues to know no bounds. We thought that that cleanup crew had actually been in place last night. Turns out that they haven't even got the permit to conduct the cleanup of the Ebola apartment. Going back to Syrian Girl now, this is a sensitive subject, but she was targeted by a huge defamation campaign recently. And then a separate incident where somebody actually called her university and basically made some astounding claims. I'll let Syrian Girl explain it. Syrian Girl, go ahead.
Well, actually, because there's a lawsuit going on and I can't actually comment very much on the case under advice of my lawyer, I can't specifically mention what the defamation was about, but I can say that it was quite horrendous, and especially in the case where the man contacted my university.
And just to get it clear, I mean, you were involved in a kind of propaganda offensive against him because you did some research which kind of disproved what he was saying. He was coming down on the side of Assad regarding the Assad's opponents, of course, regarding the chemical weapons attack. So you did some research which proved him wrong. He got a big chip on his shoulder, resentful, and he actually called your university and basically implied that you might be a terrorist. Is that the case?
Well, again, I can't comment on specifically what he said, but anyone who's been following the case might already know that I was working with Professor Ted Postel of MIT just to give him a bit of chemistry help, because he was looking into the claims by two individuals, which I'm not sure if I'm allowed to name myself on the show.
No, I think we'll avoid the names.
Okay. That made these outrageous claims to the mainstream media that a specific chemical called hexamine was smoking gun evidence that the Syrian government used the sarin on Damascus, and that this hexamine itself is the fact that it was in the soil samples is just proof enough. The problem with that is that hexamine is a chemical that's found in many explosives, and that would make sense why it would be in the soil samples. Furthermore, the man who's making these claims is not a chemist. He has no background in chemistry, but the mainstream media, because he's saying something that supports their line, has touted him as an expert. And when I helped Professor Ted Postel of MIT look into his claims, I was basically and trying to prove the fact that he has no idea what he's talking about. He has no knowledge in chemistry and has nothing to support his claims. Once he found out about my involvement, that's when he decided to attack me directly and attack my career.
Amazing. 30 seconds left. Tell people how they can support you and about your YouTube, Twitter account.
Well, if you'd like to support my defamation lawsuit against him and the other people so that I could show them that they cannot do this to anyone and get away with it, no matter how weak they are, you can please help me by donating to me.
And your YouTube is Partisan Girl. Third hour of the Alex Jones Show live on this Friday edition, and we're still joined by Syrian Girl. She wanted to make a couple of other points here in the first 5-minute segment of the third hour. We were talking about her being targeted basically for defamation. We can't go into too many details for legal reasons, but because of her research in disproving the notion that the 2013 chemical weapons attack in Ghouta was the work of the Assad government, she was viciously targeted. Syrian Girl, you wanted to make another point on that subject.
In fact, thank you so much. I'm sorry for stealing your airways. In fact, I wasn't going to make it about me or the defamation suit. I would thank anyone who would help me support, because I would love to continue to fight and to continue to, bring my point of view across. So anyone, any kind of support would be a great help. But I did want to just come back on just to mention the fact that just to answer the caller earlier, the narratives can change very quickly. And it's interesting that last year, the media, US media, was talking about, the Syrian people, the so poor civilians that are being killed by airstrikes and starvation. And, the airstrikes against Jabhat al-Nusra actually killed tens of civilians, including children. The US airstrikes did. And they also hit a grain silo and killed farmers in Raqqa when they were airstriking ISIS, and destroyed, the food supply to Raqqa. So it's very funny that these narratives can change. And now even Obama is meeting with the Christian communities in Syria to try to pretend that he's on their side, when in fact he's been trying to basically eliminate any trace of them in the Middle East, in Syria, Iraq, and probably Lebanon soon enough also. So thank you so much. I'm sorry to take up your airwaves again like this.
One more question. ISIS, what's the ultimate agenda? Is it about the partition of Syria?
Yes, I think it's to do with partition of Syria and of Iraq. And I just want to say it's not good for the American people, and it's not good for the Syrian people either. We don't want to see any troops on the ground losing their heads. We don't want to see any planes shot down by Americans either. I think the best situation here is to just live peacefully amongst each other. And yes, ISIS is definitely there to try to take over land. They're not even Syrian. They're coming in from Europe and from all over the world, from Australia and from the US, to kill Syrians and to live on their land and to make Syria as if it was their own country. And part of that is to divide Syria into three pieces: the Kurdish north, the ISIS middle, and the coast just cleaved off for the minorities.
And of course, this ISIS propaganda offensive, which has been embraced and vehemently launched by the mainstream media itself, is founded mainly in recent weeks on these beheading videos, which have raised suspicions for me. What's your take on those?
The beheading videos of journalists. Well, it's interesting that, the family members and the family spokesmen of these journalists said that the moderate rebels that Obama is supporting actually sold these men to ISIS. And it's just sort of interesting to me that the beheading videos came just in time when the Syrian air defenses in the northeast of the country collapsed to ISIS. So just when the U.S. government needed to convince the American people that they needed to go into Syria, these videotapes of these journalists being beheaded came out. And then, of course, the other point is that the U.S. Government needed the Syrian air defenses in that region to fall to ISIS before they attacked. Because as the Pentagon has continuously said, they find that the Syrian air defenses are a risk.
Okay, we'll leave it for there. Syrian Girl, thanks for joining us. We'll be back after the break with David Knight in studio covering the latest on Ebola, the economy, and more. This is the Alex Jones Show Live. Latest breaking news at Infowars.com. Keep it locked in.
Visit Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. When you're on the site, you can also tune in 24 hours a day to my daily radio broadcast. There's also a free iPhone app to listen to the syndicated radio show when and where you want.